Right, afternoon everyone. Thanks for joining us for this session on how to build a framework for effective measurement. Hopefully you're all in the right room. I was going to say if you're not, you've got a chance to leave now, but I don't want you to leave, so I'm afraid you're a captive audience. No leaving, exactly. This may sound like quite a heavy topic for straight after lunch while you're digesting, but we're going to keep it reasonably fun and interactive. So look, we've got 45 minutes to talk through this. My name's Ian Gibbs. I am JICMAIL's Director of Data Leadership and Learning. And if you're not familiar with JICMAIL, we are the industry planning currency, or the industry currency for the mail industry. So that's direct mail, door drops, business mail. We produce media metrics and effectiveness metrics, which help people plan more effective and efficient campaigns. And I'm going to finish with a plug in a second, but frankly, if you're not using JICMAIL or the mail channel, you should be, because it's the third largest one in the UK behind TV and digital. And our data is free to access, so just come and talk to the team afterwards if you want to. Today isn't just about mail, though. We are talking about building a measurement framework much more broadly than that, and the power of communicating the effectiveness of our marketing to the boardroom in these challenging times. And I'm joined by Chris from Virgin Media O2. Chris, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Chris from Virgin Media O2.
Boom!
So I look after our marketing performance and econometrics. What does that really mean? It's kind of all the measurements, bits and pieces aside from digital attribution and our research. I run that across Virgin Media, O2, and we also do a bunch of stuff with GIFGAF, who most people don't know, but are owned by O2. So yeah, hello.
I feel a bit like, we've got Mars on the other stage. It's a bit like got the pyramid in the other stage, but this is like a little niche stage where you're actually going to get a great session, and it's going to be much more personalised, and Anyway, look, the reason Chris is here is because, I'm aware that I work for an industry body, I'm an independent consultant. It's easy for me to talk about all this stuff in theory, but Chris is the one who's actually got to do this on a day-to-day basis. So as we work through the sort of building blocks and how to build a framework for effective measurement, I've got some questions for you guys, and Chris is also going to make some comments about what they're doing in their business as well. So look, a bit of background. Look, I'd probably, I don't need to sort of labour the point that at the moment, marketers and CMOs, they're under more pressure than ever. Under lots of short-term pressure. Tom Fishburne, as always, the marketeernist, absolutely sort of captures this problem in his unique style. As marketers, we have grand, lofty ambitions for our big sort of long-term campaigns, brand-building campaigns. Your quarterly sales numbers come in, and if they're not up to scratch, you're out on your ear. We live in a short-termist world. The marketing department, according to PwC, 2/3 of marketers say their department is regarded as a cost centre. Marketing isn't viewed as an investment. At the same time, we know that measurement of marketing effects is substandard, which really affects the way that CMOs are communicating the value of what they do to the board. And that is why CMO tenure is trending downwards as well. The gap between how long a CMO lasts and a CEO lasts is bigger than it's ever been. And that's why it's so important for CMOs to be able to communicate the value of what they and their departments do to the rest of the organisation. And what we see at the same time is actually, overall marketing effectiveness is trending downwards. So this data is taken from the DMA's Effectiveness Data Bank, the Data and Marketing Association's data bank. And what we can see, there was a nice little boom in effectiveness in 2020. Everyone was stuck at home more during the pandemic, proved themselves to be more receptive to advertising. There's a bit of a course correction the following year, though, and it's really just kicked in and it carried on in the cost of living crisis. And a lot of this, frankly, has been driven by decline in performance marketing effectiveness. While people are more cash-strapped than ever, it's just harder and harder to get them to respond to advertising. And so, look, if we want to arrest this decline in effectiveness, then a big part of this is measurement. Only through a sort of coherent method of testing and learning and feeding those learnings back into future campaigns and capturing them through measurement frameworks are we going to arrest this decline in effectiveness. Now, we've heard, people have talked about frameworks a lot today. There's been some fantastic sessions this morning. But I get a sense there's a lot of people looking at it going, but what is a measurement framework? What does it actually look like? So I think for today, we need to regard this session as, it's a real back to basics, to be honest. We're not going to go really deep on how to build an MMM model here. We're really just going to talk about how we should be organising and codifying our thinking about marketing effectiveness as a tool to communicating it and learning from it in the organisation. And I think, let's just view it as, if there's any questions you're too embarrassed to ask about marketing measurement frameworks, just ask them today. That's what we're here for. It's a conversation that everyone's having, as this recent written article in Marketing Week gives an example of. So, in other words, how should marketers be selecting, shortlisting, recording, storing, benchmarking campaign measurement KPIs? I guess that's what the process, this question around the process of campaign framework creation should be answering. We've got 6 steps that we're going to cover. So these are, I mean, this is by no means exhaustive. You know, there's many ways to skin a cat, as it were. This is six sort of key steps we think there are in building a measurement framework. You know, you may feel that you've got some feedback on this, other key steps that you want to add to this. I'd love to hear from you at the end if there are any other steps. But for now, the ones that we're going to walk through are, you know, picking your marketing model. We're going to be talking about how you can agree on your taxonomy, choosing the building blocks of your framework, developing a cross-organizational working group. That's a really important one. Obviously, measuring effectiveness. There's no point in having an empty measurement framework. And the key bit is the test and learn. And the learn bit is a really important bit. How do we up our organizational levels of IQ? As we go through each of these, I've got a question for all of you, and I've got a question for Chris. So, you know, hold on to your hats. First one, pick your marketing model. So look, this is all about coming up with a consistent, shared view across the organization about how marketing works, right? So look, we've studied marketing. We're all familiar with the 4 Ps or 5 Ps or whatever sort of you want to subscribe to. But it's very important that we review, I suppose, you know, the last 10, 20 sort of years of marketing theory and come up with a defined and coherent and consistent view about how it works across the entire organization. There's no point in the brand team and the response team or the reacquisition team and the retention team having very differing views about how marketing effectiveness works because we're never going to be able to sort of, I suppose, disseminate learnings in a coherent way. And of course, there's lots of different marketing models out there. You know, the famous one, of course, you know, the long and short of it from Field and Binet. It was F-Works yesterday, and Peter Field and Les Binet were on stage doing a sort of 10-year sort of retrospective. Really nice to see an interview about how their, you know, how their model has taken hold over the last 10 years. But we all know it's that classic 60-40 rule, which isn't really a rule at all. But the point is, you've got to think about what your optimum split is between that long-term brand building, short-term response. Grace Kite and Tom Roach, they got a nice little development of it, which they entitled in an article called The Wrong and Real of It. It's similar, but actually they say you can get a lot of scale initially from just activation, short-term DR activity, particularly if you're a startup. After a while, though, that plateaus, and that's where brand building comes in. And actually, brand building and sales activation, they can both work together to amplify their effectiveness. Perhaps you're into the creative effectiveness ladder. So this is something that I've used with a client to great effect. It's another piece of Peter Field work. He produced it for Cannes a few years ago. And he basically splits out all campaign types into just 6 typologies. Really basic stuff like this influential ideas, stuff that's about trying to change your behavior in the short-term sales spike, right the way up to like enduring icons, big, broad, bold, award-winning work. Actually, it might be that this is how you want to think about your marketing effectiveness. Which of these are you sort of aiming for when you're producing a new campaign? And of course, how can we not mention Byron Sharp? How brands grow, looking at, you know, the combination of mental and physical availability and what that does in terms of appealing to people at different category entry points to maximize that growth potential of brands. Of course, you know, all these theories have a lot in common. They overlap a lot. I mean, there are some crucial differences as well. Crucial differences that Byron Sharp is very keen to point out when he gets a chance. And they like to say, Byron Sharp skewers Binet and Field. They did actually address this in their interview yesterday, which is very funny. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the work of Dan White. He produces lovely cartoons about how marketing works. And in a very diplomatic way, he's actually come up with a Sharp, Binet and Field funnel, which I thought was very nice. Either way, the whole point here is come up with review the literature and come up with a unified view across your organization about how marketing works. So look, question for you guys now. And this is where get your JICMAIL pens and your notepads that are ready. So look, I'm going to ask you a question here. So do you have a shared understanding of how marketing works across your business? And you've got 3 options here. And if the answer is yes, we're completely fully aligned across the business, give yourself 10 points. And if the answer is yes, but different teams have different views, give yourself 5 points. And if the answer is no, not at all, well, really, you should get 0 points. But you're getting 1 point for that. You can see where this is heading. You're going to add up these points at the end. I'm going to give you a very spurious kind of like typology. But anyway, bear with me. So add up your points. Chris, I'm going to ask you this question now. Does your business have a shared sort of understanding how marketing works?
I wish we did.
Yeah.
I'd probably say we're somewhere around the middle one. Different teams have different points of view.
Yeah. And does that make life easy or difficult? I mean,
it's challenging.
Yeah.
I think, you know, this is nothing new for anyone in the room, but for those people who are familiar with the digital analytics, and there's been a lot of actually good chat about this earlier in the death of the cookie. I actually think that's a really good thing for digital marketers, because I think we need to get away from these vanity metrics, which everyone kind of knows we're never right. but we're available. We need to go from that to proper incrementality testing. We can come to modelling and so forth later, because I've got some probably quite different views to what people have said to this earlier, despite being a trained econometrician. Yeah. So I think it's a really good thing. I think the challenge is migrating, particularly people who, people who spend a lot of their time in search, less so display and social, just because typically the last click attribution or any kind of digital attribution is less good in those channels. But any department which is driven by a PPC team, so I don't know if there's anybody that works in travel in here, for example, like, I feel your pain. It's a hard drug to pull people off of, and maybe not even necessary, but just being able to identify, is that the right way to look at those channels or not, and have that conversation sensibly is a real challenge. So that's why I'd put ourselves in the middle. Yeah. There is a view that marketing works, but how it works and which bits we should be focusing on is something that we strive for every day, really.
Very interesting. I told you it was easy for me to come up with a theory, harder to do it in practice, but that's a very interesting perspective. Thanks, Chris. So look, the second point is look, agree on your taxonomy. It was suggested by Steph from JICMAIL. There's some sort of pun here about death and taxonomies. I couldn't quite shoehorn it in, so we've just gone for this one instead. Agree on your taxonomy. Look, I think this is really about coming out again. It's all about consistency and coherency and making sure that if we are all talking and singing off the same hymn sheet, it gets much easier to disseminate learnings across the business. We need to come up with a taxonomy for our media channels, for example, and I guess these are key fields in our measurement framework. There's lots of different ways you can come up with, I suppose, a sort of media channel taxonomy. This is one that I particularly like. It was produced for IPA F-Works last year and is updated this year. And it's just this classic view of kind of like paid, owned and earned touch points. So for example, all your paid media will relate to things like your above the line channels, email, out of home, radio, etc. Your earned touch points relate to sort of conversations and word of mouth and social. And of course, your own touch points, those are assets that you own, which we obviously don't have to pay for ad inventory in. For example, if you're a finance brand, it might be your ATM or the branch or, a physical store, for example. I particularly like this view because mail gets to straddle both worlds. It gets to be an owned channel. Mail and door drops is also a paid channel as well. But there might be other ways that you choose to organise your media channels. Perhaps you look at, acquisition versus retention channels, or digital versus non-digital, or perhaps premium versus non-premium. The point is consistency, and consistency between teams is absolutely crucial. Coming up with a taxonomy for your effects as well. So the metrics you're going to use to communicate effectiveness is a really important one. Going back to the Data and Marketing Association's data bank, there are actually, so there's 1,200 campaigns in that data bank, and there's a whopping 180 different metrics that have been identified that are being used to communicate effectiveness, which straight away, if you're trying to come up with a sort of a coherent way of talking about effectiveness, it's quite challenging when there's 180 different metrics on the board. We bucketed them into 4 different groups. I mean, one of the groups are business effects, and these are just examples here, but this is the stuff the boardroom cares about. Again, if we go back to the earlier sort of slide, if we're looking at those challenging conversations CMOs are having with CFOs and CEOs, they need to be talking about the language they care about, which are things like profit growth, shareholder value, growing market share, customer penetration. Really important to link marketing, marketing spend to these types of effects. We've also got brand effects, obviously the sort of thing that brand campaigns are tasked with. Awareness consideration, we've got direct response effects, the kind of thing that performance marketing effectiveness is tasked with, short-term sales, conversions. We've also got campaign effects, which, to be honest, aren't really effects at all, but, we have mentioned them because some people are using them to articulate effectiveness. Things like reach, frequency, video plays, clicks, likes, shares, eyeballs on ads. To be absolutely clear, these are really important metrics. Reach, frequency, JICMAIL produces these, and they're really important for planning a campaign. They're not useful for proving to the board how effective the campaign is being. So it's all about horses for courses. What are you using these metrics for? This is very much the language of campaign planning rather than the language of effectiveness, I would say. It's quite also useful as well to go through the process of clicker. Could we advance the slide, please? Because my clicker seems to have died. There we go. Actually, what we saw last year is that only 8% of these 180 I told you about actually relate to the stuff that matters most to the board. 20% brand, 31% relate to response. Actually, 40% of them relate to those less meaningful campaign metrics. As I said, these aren't unimportant. They're really important. They're just not very useful for reporting back to the board. So that has a slight concern that so many are being used there, those digital vanity metrics. Next slide, please. I think once you've developed your taxonomy, it's also quite important as well to try and create a hierarchy of which of these matter most to your business. So for example, again, this is taken from the DMA's data bank, but I recommend everyone go through this exercise for their own business to try and figure out which of these metrics matter most. At an industry-wide level, we see that those campaigns that record strong NPS growth as a brand metric record the largest number of business effects. We also know that the other brand metrics which are most strongly linked to business effects are creative interest, understanding, positive sentiment, ad recall, and purchase intent. So really important steps in the branding funnel. We can also look at the DR effects. Next slide, please. The response effects that really matter for driving business effects. There's a big retention marketing flavour to these metrics. You know, we're living in the era of lapsed loyalty, you know, very promiscuous consumers. People are really concerned with retention rates, average revenue per user, average order value. So look, this is just on an industry-wide level. These are the metrics which are really sort of driving business outcomes, but you need to assess what matters most for your business. Next slide, please. You also need to consider where newer metrics like attention fit into this picture. So this is just a grab taken from a JICMAIL's attention report, which I think is probably on your tables. You know, we know in the DM world, and actually this is true for door drops and DM, there's a nice effectiveness multiplier. You spend a lot of time with your mail or door drops, and it creates more commercial outcomes. And we know actually the channel is very attention efficient. It's more attention efficient perhaps than some other digital channels in terms of how much it costs to generate a minute of attention. You've got to decide where this fits into your framework, these newer metrics. Do you want to use it as a planning metric? Or actually, do you want to use it as a measure of effectiveness, as an outcome? And if you do, you better make sure that your board are on board with that. Because again, if you go back to them and tell them you generated 1 million seconds worth of attention, they might shrug their shoulders at you unless you've proven that it's linked to business outcomes. So, look, question for all of you guys. Does your business have a shared marketing measurement taxonomy? And as with last time, yes, you're fully aligned across the business. Give yourself 10. Yes, but different teams have different views. Give yourself 5. No, not at all. Give yourself 1. Chris, how about you? What about your business?
I've
asked you some really difficult questions. Apologies.
No, not at all. It's a good question. I just want to give an articulate answer, and that's not always the easiest thing for me. So, yeah, so we merged 2.5 years ago. 2 massive sort of household names, 2 completely different business models, 2 completely different marketing departments, even the colour palettes, you know, everything completely different. So I would have said if you asked me this in June 2021, if I could give it negative, I would have. It was just totally different, right? And I think over the last couple of years, and it's something that my team, along with our wider marketing department, have been pushing really hard for, is to be consistent. I think this is kind of funny. It's only recently I've considered myself a marketeer. Really, before that I was an analyst. But I think in recent times I realised we're not very good at practicing what we preach. And what I mean by that is consistency of our own message internally, I think, is quite poor, or at least in my experience of clients, back when I was agency side, is quite poor. And I think this was a real proof point of where that can work. So just cutting out the crap, focusing on, and we'll come to it later, but just focus on the 3 or 4 things that marketing is supposed to do. People are supposed to remember that they've seen it. It's supposed to hopefully change perceptions of your business, drive some kind of intent or view or some kind of traffic metric. And then at the bottom is conversions. And the reason I say that is we would put that more as a commercial objective, because you can take a horse to water, but you can't necessarily make him drink, right? So in that process, we've really simplified our language. I think, Ian, you touched on something earlier which is absolutely critical, and I'm sure loads of people in this room will know this, but being able to simply, and this is the really important bit, show that one of your brand metrics that you're tracking. So for instance, consideration is what we call a board metric. So we show that to our board on a monthly basis. We're KPI'd against it across the department. Proving that that links to market share growth in a really simple, clear manner is very difficult. But once you've got it, and we have, happily, for us and in our areas, across broadband, mobile, the SVODs, because we play in that space with Virgin Media TV, there's a 92% correlation between consideration position within the market and market share position, right? Now, it's not causation, but at least it highlights that it's important, which is kind of what we were going for. And I think I'm waffling, but
it's because you've been through that process.
The main point is we really weren't at that point, and it is really, really important. Simplify the message, make sure everyone's talking about the same stuff, find those really simple relationships. They have to look simple. I can see Marissa here because she's nodding, but I'm sure there are other people in this room who spend their whole lives trying to find these relationships. It can be complicated to find, but you have to present it really clearly, really easy to see on a chart, so that even the simplest accountant who has no understanding, and I've used simple accountants, they have no understanding of marketing, right? They don't care, generally. They don't give a shit about what we do. All they see is cash, cash, cash. You said cost center. That's absolutely how the business sees our area, and a big cost center at that. So like, we have to do this quite a lot. It has to be really clean, and that's why I think simplifying the metrics right down to 3 or 4 things that you really care about. Within the department, you can talk about other stuff. You've got to simplify that message for the wider business, so that when you're talking about ad recall, for example, which is one of our key metrics that we talk about, because it moves. Yeah. So when a campaign goes live, it moves pretty much immediately. So for any brand specialists in the room who are constantly banging their head against the wall about your search manager or whoever coming up to you going, why haven't I got more traffic today when the campaign goes out? And you're saying, oh, well, it will arrive over the next 2 or 3 weeks, and it's a slow burn, and blah, blah, blah. It's very hard to land in any business. It's hard to believe, right? If I told you that, you'd all be, in another world with other careers, you'd all be like, yeah, all right. And even for yourselves, if you think about how you react to a brand, I bet no one in this room will think, oh, do you know what? That ad I saw 6 months ago has actually influenced me to do something now. You would never conceive of that. So it is a hard thing to explain. But to show someone, people saying, yes, I've seen an ad for our brand, has jumped up 3 percentage points since the campaign went live last week. Something has happened.
Well,
First step.
Yeah. And let's come on to those measurement methods in a bit. Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you,
Sorry,
Chris.
I'm jumping the gun.
No, not at all, not at all. Sorry, could you move the slide on? So look, the third piece of advice, choose your building blocks. And if you could move it on again, please. And this bit of advice is simply about deciding the fields that you want to capture data for in your measurement framework. We're going to reorganize these into a framework later on. This is by no means exhaustive, but this is very simply really just getting down to brass tacks now. The sort of information that you might want to capture are campaign information. What are your business objectives? What are your marketing objectives? Over what time frame are you measuring? Short term, long term? What channels and budget are you measuring? There needs to be lots of dynamic fields for you to enter benchmarks and baselines and targets and stretch targets and your performance and your uplift versus these targets. Of course, you want to be capturing all these metrics that we talked about as well, your campaign, business, brand and response KPIs. And hopefully if you've got a nice dynamic sort of framework, it'll shortlist for you depending on the different campaign types you select. You want to document your measurement method as well, and we'll come on to this in a second. You are using MMM or test and control or your brand tracker. And what's your campaign type? Is it an activation campaign, brand campaign, acquisition, retention? And the really important bit is your insights. What insights are you going to take out of this for optimization? What are you learning about media or targeting or audience or creative or data, which can be fed back into future campaigns? So it's not just a post-campaign evaluation box-ticking exercise. You really are feeding it back in the future. So next slide, please. So look, guys, just have a think. Has your business established what the building blocks of a measurement framework looks like? Yes, we know what all the building blocks are. 10 points, only partially 5. No, not at all. 1. Chris, what do you guys reckon?
I would put us in the top of this one.
Okay, good. That's a relief. And we're going to have a look at one of your frameworks later on, actually, so we can see where you land. Next slide, please. The fourth one, develop a cross-organisational working group. And if we could just flick onto the next slide as well. This is an important one. I think actually, it's really easy to think of measurement just being the responsibility of the measurement practitioner or the insight department or the measurement department. Now, of course, you need centralised expertise. Of course we do. But at the same time, the responsibility, not just for the measurement, but for the measurement effort, but the production of a measurement framework, which is used to communicate effectiveness and feed learnings back into future campaigns, should be the responsibility of the entire marketing machine. And I would say, and it depends what stage in the process you're in. So look, if it's in the briefing stage, if you're trying to set up, I suppose, your campaign objectives and you're trying to figure out what your hypotheses are that you want to test and learn, involve as many people as possible. Get really senior buy-in as well. You don't want to just present a fait accompli at the end of it. Get your marketing director and your brand managers involved. I would say, you're building MMM models. You need to get your finance teams involved as well. Again, I think, if we want to not be viewed as a cost center so much, let's build more like collaborative relationships with the finance team. Get your agency involved, creative agency, your media agency, that's going to be quite important. When it comes to actually delivering the measurement, perhaps you want to really just work with a much narrower, more nimble team. Perhaps it's just the insight team plus a couple of the agencies. And when it comes to disseminating those learnings, again, broaden out the entire marketing organization. And just think about, I guess the resource that you're drawing on. If you're focusing on just using internal resource, well, that's quite important because you're sort of bringing that product and industry expertise and direct access to the data. If you're going externally, talking to your agencies, it brings an alternative viewpoint and it brings that sort of creative and media expertise as well. So just think about who you're drawing into that conversation. Next slide, please. If we think about the question then, so do you have a cross-organisational working group to measure marketing effectiveness? Yes, they come together every campaign, 10 points. Yes, but only on an ad hoc basis, that's 5 points. And no, not at all, that's 1 point. So Chris, how about you guys? What do you think? Do you recommend this sort of having a cross-org working group? Does it work for you guys? Or?
I struggle with this one. You can get paralysed by having too many people involved with the process. If you have too many departments, I think it's important to disseminate the results. I think it's important to bring people along the journey, particularly your finance department, bring people along on the journey. This is all really wanky marketing talk, sorry. It's important that everyone knows what you're doing and how you're measuring, basically, and everyone understands what data sets you're using and they're comfortable with that and blah, 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 so that they believe in you as a marketing department or as a measurement expert or as an agency or whoever it is that's driving that conversation. You have to have credibility in that room, and the only way you build that is by showing people what you do. And there was a great chat in there about black boxes, and I'm a firm believer in just transparency. Get people on board with it, and then they will come with you on that journey. That takes ages, right? It's not an easy job to do. We're still on that journey, certainly with RFDs. They are the hardest people to convince. So, yeah, I'd probably say we're probably a 1 on that one, but I would say that's partially intentional.
Sure, yeah, okay, that's interesting. So look, in a not at all contrived moment of serendipity, we have your agency here as well. So you have Marissa from MGMD, who I know you work very closely with. So Marissa, from your point of view, like, as an agency, like, how do you like to work with your clients? What's the ideal way of working when it comes to measurement?
So is that how we would ideally like to work?
Yeah, perhaps give us both. Perhaps ideally what actually happens.
So I am measurement analytics. So traditionally, measurement analytics have always said very siloed with the rest of the agency, the insights team, and certainly the clients. And the way that we are evolving and what we want to transform ourselves into is to ideally be a 10, but we know that's very difficult. So move towards that middle ground where we are very integrated, not only with our agency, but also with the client teams and with whatever other external agency they've got, because that's the only way of actually coming together and draw real insight. To your point about, well, we do all this great measurement, but what's the point if no one uses it? We've had situations such as that, like we do an attribution project, and then when we go back to the client and say, what have you done with it? They're
Frustrating.
Like, nothing. So it was great, the results were fantastic, but we haven't used it in the campaign. So we are moving towards an effectiveness culture through our agency and with our clients to have this working group where we can disseminate our knowledge and look into campaigns.
That's cool, that's heartening to hear, thank you. Okay, on to the next step. Perhaps you could shift the slide on for me, please. So look, of course, measure. So this is all about, I suppose, measuring our campaign inputs, our campaign outputs. I would say, look, when you're measuring your campaign inputs and we're looking at those metrics, particularly in the brand world, I suppose, like, reach and frequency and impressions, do support your JIC. We are all here. We have been, we are all owned by the industry. We're funded by the industry, and we are here to provide really trusted, credible, transparent metrics which can be used for campaign planning. And so, of course, alongside JICMAIL for mail, you'll be familiar with the names Barb for TV, JICRED for regional, PAMCO for news brands, Radar for radio, so on and so forth. Of course, and all this data is modelled onto the IPA's Touchpoint survey, which allows for fantastic multi-channel planning. There's a brilliant paper which was written earlier this year called Signals in the Noise, which is a real call to arms, saying, look, do not forget about these trusted and transparent sources of like currency data. A really nice sort of comment from Justin Sampson, Chief Exec of Barb there as well. So look, it's all about supporting your local JIC. Perhaps we can move on a slide. And of course, I just had to do a little JICMAIL plug. This is, this is one of our dashboards that we give people access to. You plug in your campaign volumes, pick your sector, pick your target audience, and it tells you about campaign reach and frequency and lifespan and impressions and that kind of thing. It's like Google Analytics for mail, so do take a look at it. If we move on one slide, please. We also need to, of course, measure campaign outputs. And look, we haven't got time to go through, I suppose, a real deep dive on how we do this. A lot of it's been touched on already today. I've taken this from an IB chart, actually, a few years ago, where they tried to like summarize the key methods available to us. We've kind of got attribution modeling at the bottom, which is a really good way of sort of, I suppose, measuring, well, was a good way, pre-death of third-party cookies, of measuring sort of short-term effects. You've got your sort of control versus exposed incrementality tests, which sort of work in the near term. You've got your sort of big brand trackers, and at the top of the pile, you've got your econometrics or your MMM. Now, what I would suggest you do is develop your sort of, your bronze, silver, and gold measurement options, because it's not always going to be possible for every single campaign. Your gold standard should be, there's a lot of movement and a lot of talk about MMM, I suppose, and the power of MMM at the moment. That should be your gold standard. Test and control. Chris and I had a bit of a debate about this, where that should sit. Perhaps we'll talk about that in a second. But, Chris won. We stuck it in gold. Silver, copy testing, brand tracking. They're fine. Brand tracking is very useful for looking at brand shifts over time. Sometimes pinning that to marketing activity. Has awareness gone up because it's just sunny? That's why people are having more of it, eating more ice cream, more as and then bronze. Probably the worst was media-owned and platform-provided studies. If you can't afford to do it yourself, obviously your platforms can do it for you. They're probably going to tell you how amazing it was to advertise on their platform. Anyway, that's why it's bronze. So if we could move on a slide, please. I think the big thing here that everyone needs to get comfortable with, and I know lots of you will be, but it's all about, you've got to put your, if we don't believe in those media owner sort of studies about marking your own homework, and you want to go down that kind of silver or gold option, you have to put your hand in your pocket and actually fund some of this stuff. And it's very difficult. People are saying, well, I don't want to sort of take any media budget away because it reduces reach. The rule of thumb has been for years, it's a very sensible rule of thumb, devote 5 to 10% of your budget to measurement. I'd always say to people, it's better to sacrifice a bit of reach for a lot of campaign certainty. There's no point, maximising reach without any sort of learnings about what's working and what isn't. Take a little bit of reach off, use it for research, and, in the long run, you will have far more effective campaigns. So, with that in mind, next slide, please. How are you primarily measuring effectiveness? So, 10 points. We invest in an ongoing program of MMM and or tested control. 5 points. We use MMM tested control attribution occasionally. And number one, at 1 point, we rely on media owner platform studies. Boo. Chris, what do you reckon? And why this sort of debate around control versus exposed? You're sort of a big advocate of it, and I should be, because that's where I came from, the Kantar, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an econometrician by trade, so I'm always going to plug MMM. Yeah, we call it econometrics, which is, anyway. So I'd say we're 10, we have a very advanced, what I'd call advanced econometrics program. We do geo-testing and experimentation at least once a quarter across the brands. We have various types of attribution. I would also add that attribution isn't just digital attribution. There are other types of attribution modelling. So anybody that's familiar with TV squared, for example, there's lots of really good work that those guys are doing in the TV attribution, and I know they're moving into the kind of odd space as well. So just be slightly mindful that just because it's attribution doesn't mean if
unique tracking codes and stuff as well.
Yeah, we're not specifically talking about cookie tracking necessarily, and it is super valuable. Contrary to what everyone's saying, and also, is there anyone from Meta or Google in the room? No, they're not going to murder me. I think there's a reason that those platforms are pushing it. Hopefully everyone recognises that. And they're kind of trying to offer these data sets and data feeds that are really rich and detailed. Sidebar, they're not that accurate, so make sure you confirm that the data is correct with your media agency. We've had a lot of issues with that. But anyway, what they're trying to do is give you more opportunities to measure the effects of their channels. So econometrics by design is a correlational approach, right? You're just looking for movements that correlate across various different factors. And the more opportunity you have to change the shape of the input variable, by which I mean, if you just have straight impressions, that's one shape. If Google come to you and say, Marissa, yeah, but what we're going to do is split those impressions by the audience that you targeted. Well, all of a sudden, you've got maybe 4 different variables that might come in to the model. So it's all about and imagine that, in perpetuity, and it continues. So they're just trying to give you more opportunity to measure their effects, right? That's a problem to me. I don't think that's good for advertisers. I don't think it's good for agencies. It's obviously good for them, which is why they're doing it. And there's positives to it, but just sidebar on that. But I think my main point really is a bad econometrics model is significantly worse, and I mean it's damaging, versus none. Like, I really cannot stress that enough. It is damaging to your business, and there are a lot of people who do really good work in this space, and if anybody wants some names, I don't work in this space myself anymore, so I can hold my hand up and sort of say these people are good and I've worked with them myself, but whether you think that's worthwhile or not. But there are people who are just not very good at this, right? And you have to have a high level of understanding of the actual models and how they work and the different methodologies you can use and how to construct the variables and so on, which the likes of Google and Meta do, which is why they're doing this approach. But if you don't, you can end up with mental results that are just based on spurious correlations. So your ice cream in the summer is the classic example, and it is really damaging. So I actually think that econometrics should come in the middle of that pillar. I actually think that, and believe, and we practice this, and we've developed our own algorithms and tools to do this internally, so practice what we preach here. You can get them, like GeoLift from Meta is free, open source, R script, so if you've got anybody that writes in R, you can get that. I'm pretty sure Google has a solution you can use there as well. It's a little bit black box, but it's all right in our experience, and we have dived into it. It's really simple to explain to people. We have a region or a group of customers that we've not done something that look very similar to this other regional group where we have done something. Let's look at the effect between the two. It's like, to Mail's point, and we do a lot of direct mail for Virgin Media in particular, test and control, it's like bread and butter, right? It's really what you should be doing. It's really valuable. It's really simple, it's really visual, it's very easy to explain to people. You've really got two variables. You've got your media or activity that you're pushing onto it, and you've got your control region to compare against. It is that simple. You can do it with your media agency very easily. Most agencies are set up to do it. They might be a bit reluctant to do it because it requires a bit more work to do regional targeting, for example, but they are perfectly capable of doing it. I'm not looking at Marissa so that she doesn't give me evils. But they're perfectly capable of doing it. The results come a lot faster, so Ian touched on that earlier. You can do more of them, particularly if you're a high volume business. I mean, I used to work with Deliveroo, and that was all they did until they reached the saturation point, because you have to rest regions and so on, which we can come to later, and then they went into the econometric space. So for me, I cannot advocate more getting a proper experimentation program set up. It's much cheaper, Tom, much faster, requires much less detailed understanding, and can really advance your measurement approach.
Great advice. Thank you, Chris. Okay, on to the final building block. So next slide, please. So test and learn. The emphasis here should be on the learn. So look, if we move on to the next slide, this is all about, again, look, we talked about this already. Measurement shouldn't be a box-ticking exercise. It shouldn't just sit in a post-campaign evaluation, a PCA document, and get filed away somewhere. We need to make sure that we are enacting on a marketing performance feedback loop. We need to observe our findings. We need to orientate ourselves around them. We need to decide how we're going to act as a result of these learnings and then act upon them. And again, part of that is developing future hypotheses that we want to test with future campaigns. Everything needs to be fed back into future campaign planning. And these are some classic questions to consider. What have you learned from your campaign? How will you apply this to future activity? And then crucially, what hypotheses do you want to test next time? These are three fundamental questions that you and your organisation should be asking yourself when you're trying to feed back these your learnings into future activity. So look, and then so this is the final question for you guys. Are you feeding past campaign learnings into your media plans? So yes, we're systematically documenting key learnings to take forward. You get 10 points. Yes, but not in a formalised or structured way. Well, that's 5 points. No, measurement is more of a box-ticking, like backward-facing kind of exercise. You get 1 point. So all note your scores. You're going to have to add them up in a bit. Now, we haven't got long left, but what I'm going to do now, Chris, we've got an example, like a top-line example of sort of how some of your measurement frameworks look, and then we're going to build one together. Do you want to just quickly talk us through yours? And the clicker seems to be working now. Yeah, just a couple of minutes, I think.
Yeah, I won't spend too much time on this, but it's all just about, so from the top, does it? Yeah. Strategic versus tactical are these big bits of things you're trying to measure over a long or medium period of time, or is it kind of short-term, day-to-day stuff? So have that understanding of where that spectrum is. What particular taxonomy you're using? So to go back to earlier in the pack, I won't dwell too much on that. I think we're going to send this out so people can look at it. This is like genuinely broadly what we use, so hopefully that's helpful to people. What what fields are you using to capture the data? How frequently are you doing it? All those kind of things. So anything that's kind of strategic tends to be longer term, and anything that's tactical tends to be more short term. What it's trying to deliver, what metrics you're tracking against that, as a whole litany of them in there, and what those actually are. So I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there, but you'll find test and learn over here. Econometrics sits in there as well. But our brand tracking, which is actually really important for a number of reasons, particularly for creative effectiveness. Although the likes of System 1 are also very good for that, and that is consistent and available historically, and all those good things which analysts love. So yeah,
great.
That
Okay,
was
thank you.
My bit.
You're getting worryingly close, which means that time's nearly out, right?
Oh, yeah.
So look, final section. Look, time to build a framework together. And what I really wanted to do now was just show you how we take these building blocks that I referenced earlier and actually how we turn them into a framework. And it's really just about organising them into, I suppose, I wouldn't recommend building a measurement framework in PowerPoint. This is just, I would do it in a spreadsheet or build an interactive tool. But it's all about, perhaps recording a campaign information at the top, recording your campaign types, and organising your dynamic fields around benchmarks and targets and your baselines and your uplifts, the channels you're using, your measurement methods. They become your column headers, and each of the KPIs that you want to measure becomes a row, essentially. And so what this actually then ends up looking like in practice, and this is a completely fabricated campaign. Sorry, go to the next slide, please. Here, this is an example of a summer brand campaign. Our business objective is to increase market share by 5%. And we're going to do this by increasing brand consideration by 10%. That's our marketing objective. We're going to do this in Q3 this year. The channels that we're working across, we said 2 mil TV, 1 mil broadcast to VOD, and 1 million in direct mail. And we know this is a brand campaign. And in terms of like the numbers and how it all plays out, well, look, we know from previous campaigns that the average uplift we see in brand awareness is plus 2.5%. We're actually going to target more than that this time. We're targeting an uplift of 3%. Our baseline awareness score is 80%. Post-campaign, which we've tested via test and control, it's gone up to 84%. It's a 4% uplift. Obviously, that's beaten our target here of 3%, so we've given it a nice green colouring. And we've measured this just across TV. And what have we learnt? Well, we have learnt that Channel A outperformed Channel B by 10%, for example. Perhaps The Guardian outperformed, the FT, or Google outperformed Facebook or whatever. And then, look, I won't go through all of them. If you go to the next slide, please. But for brand consideration, you can see exactly the same sort of thing. Here we've outperformed by 13%, and here we've tested a combination of TV and DM with test and control. And if we can go on to the next slide, at the bottom we've measured ROI, and we've obviously tested that by MMM. So you can see how this sort of stuff starts to scale out. And that's an example of a brand campaign. If we just flick on to the next slide, we can see an example for sort of more of an activation campaign. Here it's a combination of digital display and door drops, which are great for a great acquisition channel. Here the marketing objective is actually to improve average order value. That's how we're going to deliver £2 million worth of revenue. And so, we're measuring things like offer redemption rates. We talked about the fact that attribution isn't just digital. In the door drop world, you might want to use unique tracking codes, for example, to measure effectiveness. We have a previous benchmark of 2% response rate. We want 3% this time. So our baseline is 2%. That's what we've previously seen. Actually, in the end, we got 3.5. That's a 1.5 percentage point uplift. We've coloured that in green, and we've measured that using a unique tracking code. And then if I just click on, we have got our average order value metric here. We're targeting £120 AOV from 110. We ended up with 135. That's a 13% uplift. And we measured using attribution modelling. And again, we have an ROI figure measured via MMM. So look, this is just a really simple example, but I just wanted to show you how you take those building blocks and turn it into something practical. Guys, we are out of time, but obviously the most important bit of this entire session was to tell you what on earth all those points means. So if we could flick on to the next... final thoughts. Why all this matters. Sorry, why am I getting ahead of myself? All this stuff matters. Why is it so important to build a measurement framework? Well, it's important because it allows a consistency in how we communicate the value of marketing, particularly to the boardroom. Really important in these sort of challenging times for marketers. It breaks down the silos between agencies and client, a really important one, and thanks for your comments earlier, Marissa. It allows us to build campaign performance benchmarks. We haven't touched on that enough. But if you have a consistent measurement framework, we are all doing something in the same way, then after a year, you can have some fantastic benchmarks, which will enable you to set more consistent targets. Improve marketing performance through the adoption of a test and learn culture. raising organisational levels of organisational IQ around marketing effectiveness, and like truly articulating the value of marketing in the boardroom. So look, guys, add up your scores. This is the important bit. So if we could go on to the next slide. How do your measurement capabilities stack up? We've had like measurement compared to band members in Nirvana earlier. I'm going something for a bit more current. I'm afraid I'm comparing you all to characters from Succession. So look, next slide, please. If you've got 40 plus points, you are the Logan Roy of measurement. You know, your measurement efforts are very robust, very successful, unlikely to be challenged in the boardroom. Hopefully you're less of a monster than he is. If you've got just 20 to 30 points, you're more of a Shiv Roy. You know, you're trying to do the right thing. You're successful sometimes, but it pales into it pales in comparison next to the big guy. And if you've got less than 20, your cousin Greg. Say no more. Look, I was actually going to do that based on the last series of Succession until someone told me that I'd probably be ruining it for everyone. So that's just based on the first one. Guys, thank you for your time. I don't think we've got time for questions, but we're obviously just here. So if you want to talk to us afterwards, please do. But these slides will be circulated. But you know, really appreciate your time, and I hope you found that very useful. Thank you.